So at this point, you've learned a lot. During the bootcamp, you learned about HTML, CSS, responsive web design. You learned about database design, how to create ERD SQL queries. You also learned Python. You also learned how to use Flask, a framework to create web applications. You learned how to integrate the ERD and the SQL server with your web application. You also learned about session and post. Now, when you reflect back, all those things that you've learned are the most important building blocks to build any type of web application. All the concepts you've learned, all the way up to the wall assignment, are really the 90 to 95% of the information you need to build anything you can think of. It really boils down to that. It really boils down to HTTP request response, really understanding that. Understanding how to create the front-end appearance using HTML and CSS, and adding interactions using JavaScript or jQuery. Understanding how to create a database and how to link the database with your web application to generate meaningful information. Knowing how to pass information using form, how to store information in session, and how to do it securely to prevent people from manipulating either the form data or the session data. All those are really, really important concepts. So below the video, I have also put some text information, so you can just watch the video once, but you can reread some of the text below the video. But please do even after watching the video, please go through and read the text description that I wrote to just have some of these things be reinforced. But what I want to emphasize are a few things. One is, these fundamental building blocks are really, really important. If you don't feel comfortable with some of these concepts, and if you especially skip any of the mandatory assignments, it's time for you to evaluate whether it's better for you to go back and finish the mandatory assignments you skipped, or whether it makes more sense just to skip some of the assignments and go into Django. My very strong recommendation, and I can't force anyone to do what I think, but my strong recommendation is do not ever skip mandatory assignments. You may think you're saving some time by skipping some of the assignments and going to the advanced concept. I mean, out of all the students I've taught, and I've taught directly hundreds, indirectly thousands of people, I've never seen anyone who skipped the assignments. It may seem like temporarily they're gaining speed a little bit. It always ends up taking longer because there were some earlier concepts they were struggling on, that if they really mastered that, they would have had an easier time, but it just takes them longer because they skip. So do not ever skip mandatory assignments. Now, so what should you do? At this point, some of you who have done a lot of computer programming before or a lot of engineering would be able to stay on pace. The curriculum, the bootcamp is really intense. It is hard. It's not normal for someone new to learn these things in a matter of weeks. It's not typical. We're asking you to do something extraordinary, and you're doing well if you are watching this video. And even if you're a few days behind, it's okay. This is supposed to be hard. But what I wanted to do is kind of explain what lies ahead after Flask, and for you to really evaluate, does it make sense for me to stay in Flask or should I go to Django? And I would just want to make that really easy. Here's a question that you ask to see whether you should move on to Django or whether you should stay in Flask. The question you should ask is, if you had to redo the wall assignment, including building the login and registration, how long would it take? If it takes you anything more than a full day to do that, you should really go back and really master the fundamentals. If you know that you can do it in 8 hours or less, you're ready for Django. Go in and do that. So before, I know we're still on Flask, but let me tell you a little bit more about Django. Django is a good framework, and for Python, Django kind of has been embraced as the default framework. But Django has a lot of advanced functionalities that builds upon the fundamentals that you really need to know in Flask. If you don't, it's going to seem magical, you're not going to understand, and it's just going to take you a lot longer to build something in Django. Okay, now one other thing to have in mind. You can build anything you can think of in Flask. You don't need Django. Django is basically just adding an OOP layer on top of Flask to just organize the codes better. So instead of having something in server.py, you just split that up into 3 different folders: models, views, and controllers, which you will learn later about. It's not needed. It's not mandatory. In fact, if you haven't had a lot of programming experience prior, it's definitely okay just to stay in Flask and to really master the fundamentals. Have a good understanding on session and post. Really take some time to learn Ajax, which is kind of the next chapter. You cannot call yourself a developer in the in the internet era now if you don't know Ajax, right? Ajax is a front-end technology. It's not a back-end technology. You have to learn how to use Ajax, and of course, you're not going to feel perfectly comfortable, but you have to feel decently comfortable to be able to do some of the Ajax assignments. It's much better that you do that in Flask and stay in Flask and master the fundamentals. Take your belt exam in Flask. There's no shame. There's totally okay. Focusing on the fundamentals are fine. And you can then spend your weekends or project week or extra time after the bootcamp just to pick up Django. I guarantee that if you spend time on the fundamentals in Flask, really understood that well, and then go on to your second and the third stack, and then go back to Django, you will learn Django very, very quickly. It will be so easy because you master the fundamentals. You skip the fundamentals, you go into Django, you're gonna walk out very confused, and then the second and third stack will be much, much harder because you never got the fundamentals. Remember that the Python track is the fundamental track. It's not really a Django track. Django, in my opinion, is a nice to have. It's not a must to have. I would rather 100% of the time get someone who's strong on the fundamentals in Flask, 100%, than someone who's shaky on Django and who doesn't really understand what things are being done behind the scene in Django. Right? Go for the fundamentals. Go for the mastery. Don't worry about, but some of our cohort members are moving on to Django. Don't worry about that. They may have prior programming experience. Maybe they put in 20 to 30 more hours than you did. Okay, don't give up on yourself. Be positive, and then really master the fundamentals. After this video, there are some assignments to really help you understand some of the security concerns, which is really important. You should be thinking about how can people manipulate session data. That's very easy to do. What if they hacked into my database and got all of these fields? How do I prevent that? The SQL injection, as well as if they had access to the password. That's why you want to encrypt it, right? All these things, you gotta, it takes time for that to be fully absorbed, right? Take the time to learn it. Do not ever skip mandatory assignments. All the assignments in Django are all optional, right? It's really to push, those who, now have a pretty good grasp on the fundamentals, who could build a wall under 8 hours, and to give them additional tool sets. By now I know multiple frameworks, I probably dabble with more than 10 different MVC frameworks. Django is a decent one. It's probably my top 7, or in other words, my bottom 3. It's solid, and it's the best framework when the MVC framework, or it's slightly different, but it's not the best. You will learn a really good framework. You will actually create your own framework when you go into the min stack. Java, C#, there are more advanced Rails, advanced frameworks. Django was built not really following the traditional MVC architecture. It's doing something a little bit unique, a little bit differently. And that's why this being the first track, being at the fundamental track, do not put so much value on am I getting Django. Focus on the fundamentals. And again, Django, if you spend 2 to 3 days later during project week or afterward, just browsing through a video, if you got the fundamentals, you're like, oh, this is easy. Instead of doing this in server.py, now I have 3 folders. I do it this way. There is a thing called ORM where you don't have to do SQL queries, but also there are people who don't understand how to do SQL queries properly and then move on to Django, and it's a huge stumbling block for them. Do not make that mistake. Understand how to be able to do simple select statements, group by statements, join statements, all in SQL. And that's really, really important. So again, please focus on the fundamentals. Please focus on the SQL queries, the Ajax. really getting comfortable with session and pose, HTTP request and response, the other things that I listed below the video. And again, if you can do the wall under 8 hours from scratch, still go into Django. You can challenge yourself more. Go to Django if you can finish that in 8 hours. If you can't, go back. It's okay to redo some of the assignments. Sometimes you have to redo the wall a few times until you feel comfortable. That repetition is very, very needed in the industry for you to get comfortable, okay? Do that repetition, study hard. Spend, if you're on site, 70 to 90 hours a week. If you're doing online, we understand you have a job, so you can't, put in that much time, but put a lot of time. The only way to really master this is by putting the time, getting your brain rewired for you to now not only think in if and else statements, for loops, the fundamental building blocks that you were taught in algorithm. Now, how do I build something using, routes? How do I build something using session, post? How do I secure that? Can I build that, using Ajax? Do I need to build another server? All that is all covered up to this point. I've seen many applications that are all built in Flask, not using Django, totally fine. So just wanted to focus on that. If you have any questions, please talk to your instructor and get that resolved. Again, fundamentals are more important on whether you just know Django or not. Django is completely optional. Is really for those who already feel comfortable with building the wall assignment under 8 hours. Okay, and don't be too hard on yourself. This is hard. It's supposed to be hard. I'm pretty sure if you came this far, you're doing well. Put in the time. Be optimistic, and also remember to help other people. The best way to learn is by teaching others. Verbalize what you have learned. Again, this is why we tell the instructors not to go in and give one-to-one debugging, because we feel like we are taking away that learning opportunity from everyone else. So if you're feeling shaky on some of the concepts, volunteer for opportunities to help someone else in your cohort, whether you're on-site or online. Verbalize something, you will retain 95% of the information. Watch videos, you will retain 5 to 10%. Do assignments, you will retain maybe 50 to 60% of that information. Verbalize what you have learned. Help each other. It also kind of de-stresses you, and sometimes when you explain some concept to other people that were struggling, and maybe you were struggling too, but the process of having to explain something does magical thing where difficult concept all of a sudden kind of makes sense. You may actually learn in the process of teaching. Some new things that didn't click, all of a sudden it will click. Help others. That's the best way to really learn and master these concepts. Okay? Good luck, have fun. If you have any questions, feel free to, please reach out to your instructors and, talk about this. Okay? All right, bye-bye.